VE Day 1945, a victory for the Soviet Union and the United States. One victory, multiple narratives, depending on whether you were victor or loser. In Russia, the memory of the victory over Germany has become more an article of faith. Cynicism and nuance are conveniently or purposefully forgotten, and a new narrative is created. So, join me, Jan Darasz, on how we got here.
VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, marked the end of a long and brutal chapter in human history. On May 8, 1945, news of Germany's surrender reached the world, sparking jubilant celebrations across the globe. For millions who had endured years of war, VE Day was a day of immense relief. The constant fear of bombings, the rationing of basic necessities, and the ever-present threat of losing loved ones finally gave way to a sense of liberation. People poured into the streets, singing, dancing, and feasting in a spontaneous outpouring of joy. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who had become a symbol of defiance during the war, addressed the nation in a radio broadcast. He acknowledged the victory but cautioned that the fight wasn't entirely over. He was right. The war in the Pacific continued, casting a shadow over the celebrations. VE Day wasn't just a British celebration. People in allied countries from the United States to Australia took to the streets to mark the occasion. However, the celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that the war wasn't entirely over. Many nations had lost loved ones and had soldiers still fighting overseas. VE Day wasn't just about revelry, it was also a day of reflection. Many families mourned the loss of loved ones, while others worried about those still fighting. The war had left deep scars, both physical and emotional, and the road to recovery would be long. VE Day marked a turning point in history. It signaled the end of Nazi tyranny and the beginning of a new era. However, the road ahead was filled with challenges. The war had devastated economies, and the political landscape had been fundamentally altered. The world was entering a new era, the Cold War, with its own set of conflicts.
Joining us today is Professor Agnieszka Legucka. She is a Russian analyst at the Eastern Europe program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for coming onto our program. Great to have you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're going to analyse or discuss this quasi-religion that Russia has had or is having, the cult of 1945. Could you briefly describe that for us and its origins and development? Is this a recent phenomenon? Why 1945 in particular?
It is very important for Putin regime because after the Second World War, Soviets didn't want to have such a huge celebration because many of soldiers still remembered the cruelty of the war. So they didn't have such a vision and such a theater that we are observing right now. And afterwards, when, for example, Gorbachev was in power, they had only like 5 years ceremony of 8th of May, why Russians preferred this date. And then after Yeltsin time, there was not every year, but definitely started to be very important for Putin because he exactly is trying to look back to the Soviet time and base on the, as you said, signs of this moment of victory. And I don't know when exactly, I cannot give you one year, exact year, when the slogan "No More War" they started to create and reshape to the "We Can Win Again." And Putin is a guy or a person who is using war in the international relations against Chechnya, against Ukrainians, against Georgians in Syria. So he really influenced with this Second World War memory to compare this symbolic actions exactly to this year, this war, and this moment that praise his power.
What does the Russian ideology in this sense stress, underline, and what has it left out in the in our memory and the history of the Second World War?
I think that Putin is capturing the history and memory of this war, of the Second World War. The first thing that from the past they are thinking, I mean, Russians are thinking that the war started in 1941. They are not comparing the situation with Poles who were first victims of the Nazist regime. And then they started to monopolize somehow this victory because they are strengthening the position that it was the Soviet who fought with Nazis, with Hitler. And then he's not remembering about Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, who were very important element of this victory. Now it is very important for him to repeat this history. He really looked at to have the same war with Nazis. That's why he is calling Ukrainians as Nazis, because he really knows his society. In this Russian society, the memory of winning the war with Nazis is very, very important, and he wants to have the same war again to be a victorious leader among his citizens.
Presumably things like the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the American Lend-Lease supplies to Soviet Union during the war, the global aspect of the war. It was the British and the Americans who fought the global war in the Pacific. Presumably these are actually downplayed or not mentioned at all. Is that an accurate thing in this legend?
Yeah, that's totally true, and I would say even more. He's trying to pose the idea that those Americans, those Brits, are colonial power again. So actually, he's really reversing the symbols of today's to the past, to the Soviet time. I was hearing the speech of Vladimir Putin on 9th of May, and exactly he said he started with Tavarishi.
Yes.
Like it was in the Soviet time.
Comrades, yes.
And he was also trying to say that this is the Saint War. And the Saint War is going on right now in Ukraine. And he's trying to show that Americans, Brits, and how he calls collective West is trying to, again, repeat the colonial war in Ukraine. Because the struggle, their military struggle, they have not with Ukrainians. They are not saying like this because they feel much more prouder to be fighting with the collective West, not with Ukrainians.
The idea of this crusade that Russia, as you mentioned, fighting a holy war, it seems to be a recurrent theme in Russian history. So, for example, during the Soviet times, at least it had a gift, a benefit to the nation, which was global communism, saving mankind, blah-de-blah. Is this a necessary thing for Russia to have, as the Russians see themselves? You have to have a mission.
It's kind of symptomatic to the great power, or even if Russia is not a great power as it was during the Soviet time, it's much less powerful than it was before, but still that kind of idea of being superpower is still present, and I would say that it's that's like, sometimes I have a feeling that either Russia is expanding because it's so afraid of collapsing, and you have the idea they need to be everywhere. They need to be powerful, otherwise everything will destroy. And in that sense, Putin is remembering the 90s, showing that this was the cruelest and dark time because we were collapsing. On the opposite side, you have the expansion, territorial expansion, which is very determined by like old vision of geopolitics, right? That the territory is the most important thing. And they had in the history struggle. They were struggling with whether they are part of Europe, whether they are part of Asia, where to go. So even going back to the very old history of Russia, they are saying that after the Munich Philophiae, they are the third Rome. And after that, in 19th century, they started to talk that they can be Eurasian power. And going further at the beginning of 20th century, they recognized the idea of Eurasianism, that Russia neither is Asia, neither is Europe. It's like the whole state civilization.
Is there a class of intellectuals that actually have formulated such theories? We've heard of Alexander Dugin and literary types such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who have this idea of this Holy Russia, Mother Russia theme. Is this a group of individuals, or is this a class of thinkers that do the thinking about how Russia should be?
Dugin is repeating the idea of Eurasianism from Piotr Sawicki. He escaped from Bolshevik Russia, and he was the writer and inventor of the Eurasianism, that Russia is not part of any part of the Europe or Asia, as I told you before. But they are individuals. At some point, also kind of mirror for the people's identity. And Russians do identify themselves as a huge civilization, unique in the world. And I always some kind of have an impression from the book Geopolitics of Emotion, Dominique Moisy. And he said that Russians are actually a mixture of two emotions. The fear that they have such a huge territory and they cannot protect it effectively, and the proud, that they are very proud and different than others.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Professor Legucka, thank you very much for coming on to the program.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you. So that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. So join us next time for How We Got Here.